We will now move to the next segment of the event, the technical presentation by Maximo Torero, Assistant Director General for the FAO Economic and Social Development Department. Maximo, you have the floor.
Good morning to all of you, and it's a real pleasure for me to present the main key results from this report. Let me first start by thanking all the partners that work, the 5 agencies. This was a real teamwork since the beginning, so please join me in thanking them for all the efforts in making this a reality. The report this year consists of 2 parts. Part 1 provides the latest estimates and evidence of progress towards ending hunger and ensuring access to food, SDG Target 2.1, and ending all forms of malnutrition, SDG Target 2.2. Part 2 of the report provides an in-depth theme analysis on the underlying factors and drivers behind the observed food security and nutrition trends and links progress towards improved food security and nutrition to other SDGs. This year, Part 2, as it has already been mentioned, looks specifically to the extent in which slowdowns and downturns is interlinked with malnutrition and hunger. Now, it's important to mention that this report is thicker this year, and the reason why it's thicker is because we wanted to be extremely transparent on all the methodologies being used. So you will see significant detail on how we calculate each of the numbers we present so that anybody can replicate them if they want to look at them and learn from that. Why it's so important to understand the global trends in food security and nutrition? It's also important first to understand that food security and nutrition are interrelated. There are several pathways from food security or inadequate food access to multiple forms of malnutrition. And the Director General from FAO has clearly stated this. The first links food insecurity to undernutrition through diets characterized by insufficient intake of calories and macro and micronutrients. The second link is less obvious and links food insecurity to overweight and obesity, which is directly linked to higher cost of nutrition foods, stress of living with food insecurity, and physiological adaptations to periodic food restriction and to maternal and child food deprivations that increase risk of becoming obese. All help explain why food insecure families may be at a higher risk of undernourishment and overweight and obesity. But let's look at what we are observing in terms of the indicators with this report this year. The first indicator on undernourishment shows that after decades of steady decline, the trend in world hunger, as measured by the prevalence of undernourishment, reverted in 2015. It has remained virtually unchanged in the past 3 years at a level slightly below 11%. While the prevalence of hunger is practically unchanged at the global level, in the last 3 years it continues to rise in many countries. Indeed, the situation is almost alarming in Africa, where hunger is slowly but steadily on the rise in almost all subregions, making Africa the region with the highest prevalence of undernourishment at almost 20%. Hunger is also slowly rising in Latin America and the Caribbean, although its prevalence is still at the level of 7%. In Asia, the prevalence has been slowly decreasing, reaching a little over 11% in 2018. The exception is Western Asia, that shows a continuous increase since 2010, with more than 12% of its population undernourished today. Moreover, the number of hungry people in the world is still slowly on the rise. It is estimated that more than 820 million people still do not have enough to eat in 2018. Importantly, the largest number of undernourished people, 60% or more than 500 million out of the 820 million, live in Asia. A further 30% of all undernourished people in the world live in Africa. These trends underscore the immediate challenge of achieving the zero hunger target by 2030. And as it was mentioned by the director of WFP, this is unacceptable, and this is something that we need to change. One of the new things that this report brings this year, it introduces a second indicator for monitoring the SDG 2.1, the prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity based on the Food Insecurity Experience Scale. While severe food insecurity is associated with the concept of hunger, the numbers of undernourishment we mentioned before, people experiencing moderate food insecurity face uncertainties about their ability to obtain food and have been forced to compromise on the quality and or quantity of the food they consume. In the graph you are showing, the red area shows the severe food insecure, the orange shows the moderate food insecure. So a broader look at the extent of food insecurity beyond severe levels and hunger reveals that an additional 17.2% of the world population, or 1.3 billion people, have experienced food insecurity at moderate levels, meaning they did not have regular access to nutritious and sufficient food. Considering all people in the world affected by moderate levels of food insecurity, Together with those who suffer from severe food insecurity, it is estimated that over 2 billion people do not have regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food, or 26.4% of the world population. This happens mostly in low and middle-income countries, but also in high-income countries, including 8% of the population in North America and Europe. And this is exactly the crisis that the Director General of FAO was mentioning and our other directors. The problem of overweight and obesity is affecting at all levels of income in all the countries of the world. The lack of regular access to nutritious and sufficient food that these people experience puts them in greater risk of malnutrition and poor health. In this graph, we are showing the distribution across regions of the FIES indicator. Total levels of food insecurity, moderate plus severe, have been on the rise at the global level as well as in most regions in the world. The prevalence of food insecurity, moderate or severe, is much higher in Africa than in any other part of the world. Here, food insecurity affects more than half of the population. Latin America is next with a prevalence of food insecurity of more than 30%, followed by Asia 23% and North America and Europe at 8%. These differences also exacerbate even more when we look within regions. There are also notable gender differences, as it was mentioned before, in food insecurity. In every continent, the prevalence of food insecurity is slightly higher in women than in men, with the largest differences found in Latin America. Now, how we are doing in other indicators? Malnutrition exists in multiple forms, and the pace of progress is too slow to meet the global nutrition targets of 2030. In this figure, we bring several indicators to capture all forms of malnutrition. Despite the improvements in breastfeeding, which is the bar increasing, low birth weight estimates, which are included for the first time in this year's report, indicate that 1 in 7 live births was characterized by low birth weight in 2015. 1 in 7. No progress has been made in reducing low birth weight since 2012. Globally, the prevalence of stunting among children under 5 years is decreasing, and the number of stunted children has also declined. But still, and let me repeat, still we have 149 million children which are still stunted. The pace of progress in having the number of children who are stunted and in reducing the number of babies born with low birth weight is too slow to be on track towards meeting the SDG 2 nutrition targets. Not only that, if you look at the numbers of anemia, they are also not reducing, which again is something that we need to fix and which is easy to fix. No region in the world is exempt from the epidemic of overweight and obesity. Globally, the prevalence of overweight and obesity continues to increase in all regions of the world, particularly at small school-age children and adults. Africa and Asia bear the greatest share of all forms of malnutrition, and these are when we have multiple forms of malnutrition at the same time. In 2018, for example, they accounted for over 9 out of 10 of both all stunted and all wasted children. 9 out of 10. And nearly 3/4 of all overweight children worldwide. Now, this report tries to bring also the economic slowdowns and downturns. And why this is so important? Because the latest global economic prospects warn of further slowing and stalled economic growth in many countries. And how is this related to food security and nutrition, which is the key topic of this report? Understanding how economic slowdowns and downturns are impacting on hunger is critical to understanding future trends in hunger and malnutrition, especially given the dark predictions of the latest global economic prospect, which showing an stall in economic growth and in many countries, including emerging and developing economies. What we know and what we can learn from the evidence. First, that hunger has increased in many countries where economy has slowed down or contracted, especially during the period of 2011 to 2017. Out of the 77 countries that experienced a rise in hunger, 65 countries saw their economy slowing down or contracting. 44 out of these 65 countries are middle-income countries. Only 19 out of the 65 are low-income countries, of which 17 are located in Africa. 17 of the 19. 32 out of these 65 countries are in Africa. Several are in Asia, 17, followed by Latin America and Caribbean, 11, and Oceania, 3, and Eastern Europe, 2. In addition, we know that economic shocks are contributing to prolonging and worsening the severity of the food crisis caused by conflict and climate shocks. It was raised that these are man-made created problems in the case of conflict and also in the case of climate change. For example, in 2018, in 33 food crisis countries, economic shocks worsened the severity of the security situation, affecting more than 96 million people. For these countries, economic shocks include spikes in unemployment, lack of regular work, currency depreciation, and high food prices. Now, one of the characteristics of these countries that are more vulnerable are that they are import or export dependent. So we need an enormous effort to try to assess what will be the impact of changes in the level of import and export dependence. High level of export and import dependence on primary commodities have a statistically significant and negative effect on food security for low and middle income countries. A 1% increase in commodity export dependence leads to an average 2.2% increase in hunger per year, and that's the first orange bar in this graph. For countries with high commodity import dependence, which normally are the poorest, the effect is stronger, as 1% increase in commodity import dependence causes an average increase in undernourishment of 3.8%, the dark blue bar. But when we unpack this effect and we try to split out oil import dependence from food import dependence, the impacts are enormous. A 1% increase in food import dependence brings 8% per year increase in undernourishment. This is the light blue bar. At the same time, we know that years where we have positive effects in terms of price booms, the effects in reducing undernourishment is positive but very small, which is the last gray bar shown. Now, if we link this issue to the SDG 10, inequality, we also find that income inequality matters a lot, but also that other forms of inequality, including inequality in productive assets, distribution, and in access to basic services, including healthcare, as well as inequalities related to marginalization, social exclusion, and intra-household inequalities. In the example that we are showing here, we're just looking in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, where arable land is relatively abundant compared to other regions, the distribution of productive land as measured by the Gini index. And as you will see, there's a significant level of inequality in access to land. We also know that income inequality is rising in 50% of the countries, especially in low-income and middle-income countries. And we also know that economic slowdowns or downturns disproportionately undermine food insecurity and nutrition where inequalities are the greatest. The best examples of success in reduction undernourishment and stunting has been in countries where inequalities to access to services has been reduced. And Brazil has been an example for that. Income inequality increases the likelihood of severe food insecurity, and in this effect is 20% higher for low-income countries compared to middle-income countries. So, dear colleagues, the situation of ending hunger and all forms of malnutrition by 2030 requires a scale-up and bolder action. Economic resilience must be strengthened to safeguard food security and nutrition against economic adversity. In the short term, countries need to protect incomes and purchasing power so as to counteract economic adversity and other drivers as climate change and conflict. We are now alerted that the slowdowns and downturns could have significant effects. For example, we need to act now in bringing up proper social protection programs with careful targeting, public works programs, and other safety net mechanisms that will allow us to minimize the potential future problems that we will be facing if we go into a slowdown or a downturn. In the longer term, countries need to invest to reduce economic vulnerabilities and inequalities, build capacity to withstand shocks through counter-cyclical policies for which we have significant experience in many Latin American countries, maintain health and other social expenditures, and use policy tools to create healthy food environments. Dear colleagues, we need to fix our food system. If we want to achieve our SDG goals, we can't wait any longer. So my proposal to all of you is to take the number we have today, the 11%, and the stabilize, which is stabilized this time, and to change again to a downward slope and reduction of undernourishment in the future. Thank you very much.